Last time we did our last story in Genesis, but that wasn't the last video we're going to do on Genesis. This one will be. You see, we covered a ton of ground going through Genesis, a ton, and I think it would be helpful for us to do a little recap. But even though this will be the last video on Genesis, I promise, those stories that we looked at, they're going to keep popping up again and again as we go through the story of the Bible. So what did we cover in Genesis? A lot. We heard about when God made everything. We covered when God made people and that he made people in his own image. We also heard about the first sin, when people listened to the devil instead of God. And that was a big, big problem. And it's going to continue to be one of the central issues that we see running through the entire story of the Bible. You see, before sin, heaven and earth were united. God walked with people in the garden. People talked with God face to face. But then sin entered the picture, and it broke the relationship. It broke the connection. Sin got in between us and God. And then death entered the picture. Death as the ultimate reminder of the consequences of sin. But God made a promise. He promised that he was going to send someone to crush the head of the serpent, to send a savior to fix the mess that sin had made. And so, we're invited as we go through Genesis to ask ourselves each time we meet someone new, is this the savior? And at this point, we've finished the story of Genesis. We know how it went. Adam and Eve's son murdered his brother. Clearly not the guy we're looking for. And it just got worse and worse until we get to Noah. And by Noah's time, sin had gotten so bad, God decided it would be best just to start over. To wipe out sin, literally, with a flood. Sin was still around after the flood, but the point was made. God does not tolerate sin. And so the sin problem is another one of the threads that we pick up, and we follow, and we investigate as we go through the story of the Bible. We also got introduced to the idea of covenant. Now, God makes covenants with people. They're like contracts or promises, but they are a way bigger deal. Now, in the covenant with Noah, God promised to never flood the earth again, and we have seen that God has kept that promise. But this idea of covenants is going to keep coming up and coming up. So keep your eyes and your ears open as we continue through the story of the Bible. After Noah's time, we meet Abraham and his family. And Abraham and his family are going to be the focus of the Bible as we continue all the way through until we finish the Old Testament. Now, God called Abraham to up and move, to leave everything and everyone that he had ever known, and to trust God and follow him to a new land. Now, Abraham didn't do it all perfectly, but it is a wonderful image of being a follower of God. Now, I mentioned Abraham and his family, but you may recall there was a problem with that. Abraham and his wife, Sarah, couldn't have kids, and at this point, they were way, way too old to be having children. And yet, God promised them that they would have a big family. Now, as we looked through Abraham's story, we saw an interesting, important thing. Abraham made some very, very big mistakes along the way. But God still kept his promise. Abe and Sarah had a kid named Isaac. Isaac would go on to have two sons of his own, Jacob and Esau. Now, Esau was his father's favorite, and Jacob was the tricky brother who stole the blessing from Esau. But we see that despite Jacob being a terrible brother and all around not a good guy, God still kept his promise. And we learned that when God makes promises, it is up to his faithfulness, even in the face of our unfaithfulness. And what's more is at the end of Jacob's story, he met his brother again, and Esau forgave him and showed us a little bit of the heart of God. Now, the final story in Genesis focused on Jacob's 12 sons, and in particular his son Joseph, his favorite. Joseph's brothers sold him as a slave, and as we looked through his story, it seemed like at every turn it just got worse and worse for him. But at the end, we saw that God took everything that was bad that happened to him and made something good come out of it. Joseph saved Egypt. Joseph saved his family and forgave his brothers. just like Jesus does for us. So that was basically Genesis. That was the first book of the Bible, our introduction to the story of the Bible, and what an introduction it was. It introduced us to so many of the ideas, so many of the concepts, and so many of the questions that we're going to follow as we continue through the story of the Bible.